Hello, I'm David Uy, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, DC. We're the first and only museum in our nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. Tonight, we're discussing two short documentaries about Honolulu's Chinatown with two amazing filmmakers. If you have not been able to see these shorts yet, the links will still be active for a few days following the program. And you can find those links in your original registration confirmations. So this program is made possible through the generous support of Dr. Joseph W.C. Young and Mrs. Barbara Young. So to get us started, Dr. Young, the honorary mayor of Honolulu's Chinatown, will say a few words.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us on this webinar. In today's program, we are talking about a subject that is very dear to my heart. As honorary mayor of Chinatown, Honolulu Chinatown, nothing gives me more pleasure than to help promote the importance of Chinatown as a cultural and historical landmark. I remember helping my father and uncles run a produce market at Oahu Market, which still exists today. Chinatown today is filled with historic buildings and continues to be a cultural gathering place for all, including the local Chinese. I want to thank filmmakers Robin Lung and Kimberlee Bassford for highlighting the efforts to save Chinatown and challenges we face today. I want to thank the Chinese American Museum of Washington, D.C. for hosting this web event. Please enjoy the webinar. Mahalo, aloha.
That's terrific. So thank you, Dr. Young. We really appreciate you taping that. We have a lot to talk about this evening, so I just wanted to briefly introduce our guests. Robin Lung is an independent filmmaker based in Hawaii. Her documentary, Finding Kukan, focuses on the overlooked producer of Kukan, Lingai, and she was nominated for several awards at the Hawaii's International Film Festival, CamFest, and the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. Lung has produced the film Washington Place, Hawaii's First Home, which focused on Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii, and she was an associate producer for the 2008 documentary Patsy Mink, Ahead of the Majority. She was also an additional producer on Nova's Killer Typhoon. So in tonight's program, we'll be discussing Nancy Bannock, Saving Honolulu's Chinatown, that premiered at the Hawaii International Film Festival in November of 2022. Next, Kimberlee Bassford is an independent documentary filmmaker who advances equality by spotlighting stories of girls and women of color, cultural identity, and mental health. She directed and produced the documentaries, the one many of you just saw, My Chinatown with Aloha, Winning Girl, Patsy Mink, Ahead of the Majority on PBS, and Cheerleader, which appeared on HBO Family. She was also the producer of two national PBS documentary series, Unnatural Causes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick, and The Meaning of Food. And last but not least is our moderator, Professor Ken Lum. As chair of the Fine Arts Department at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design, Professor Lum has a distinguished teaching record, deep international experience of exhibitions and public art commissions, in addition to being a working artist as a photographer and sculptor. He has published widely and is a founding editor of Yishu, the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. Dr. Lum has was made a Guggenheim Fellow in 1999 and was awarded a Killam Award for Outstanding Research in 1998. And he is also, or no, that is from the Natashan Foundation Visual Arts Award, which he received in 2007. So know that all three of our guests, I've only mentioned a fraction of their credentials and accomplishments just to get us going, but we are so excited to have you here. And Dr. Lum, would you like to start us off? Oh, is Dr. Lum not on?
I think he might have dropped off.
He's not on the panelist group.
Okay, let's see. Let's
You have
just see.
to let him back in. Yeah, after our sound check, he logged off, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, while I'm retrieving Dr. Lum out of the list, maybe we could just get started. Just talk a little bit about how you came to this topic. Obviously, you're both in Hawaii and it's close geographically to you, but how did you come across the story, Robin, of Nancy Bannock's efforts, or were you already aware prior to this project?
Hi, everybody. I just want to quickly acknowledge all the attendees. I wish we could see each other in person. I see some familiar names in the attendee list and a lot of old friends and some new people I don't know. So this is a really great opportunity. I first learned about Nancy Bannock. I didn't know who she was, most of my adult life, but I have a nonprofit that I work with a lot, the Historic Hawaii Foundation, and their mission is a lot to preserve historic sites, but also to preserve culture and communities in Hawaii that are unique to Hawaii. And I do some video work for them. And one of their officers in a conversation during COVID had told me that they were preserving Nancy Bannock's slide collection at the Hawaii State Archives, and that she thought that Nancy would be a really great subject of a documentary, but that they had, meaning the Historic Hawaii Foundation, didn't have funding for that. And she told me a little bit about Nancy's accomplishments and shared with me some of the photographs that were being preserved, and they were really amazing photos of a lot of places that have disappeared from Hawaii, or showing how Hawaii was in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of it brought back memories from my childhood. And so I was really curious about this woman. And I said that, well, I would keep an eye open for grant opportunities that might fit. And State Foundation Culture and the Arts call out for Corona relief funds for artists came out, and I applied with the partnership of Historic Hawaii Foundation as a presenter of the film, and eventually the film will be on that organization's YouTube page. But anyway, that set me off on a investigation into Nancy Bannock. And for people who saw the film, you see that Nancy Bannock is shown in person talking, and that really was a great find, to find those little clips and interviews of Nancy herself, because I wasn't able to meet her in person. She had already passed away when I had found out about her. So this has kind of been an investigation into finding out something about somebody and a whole period of time in Hawaii that I had no inkling of before.
Yeah, it really is. It's a individual story of heroic activism, and then it's also a story that we've seen repeated many times across this country in in our, our nation's Chinatowns. And, it's just it's wonderful to see how one person's activism, really sparked a whole, movement to protect these, this culture and, these communities. Ken, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry,
I
we
didn't
lost you
realize
there.
the timing. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's great, both films. And maybe I could do a little bit of historical context, first of all, and then I'll ask Robin and Kimberlee a question. I think the story of Chinese in these ethnic enclaves of Chinatown is a very epic story. They were foundational to the United States Republic. They were foundational to many other nations as well, especially throughout the Americas and New Zealand, Australia, Peru, Mexico, and so on. So it wasn't just a story that was just localized to the United States or to the Kingdom of Hawaii at the time, but to many, many countries all around the world. And the Chinese formed these ethnic enclaves called Chinatowns. And they were there not just because of, they were to form kinship with other Chinese members who were, far away from home, but also there were services that would be provided for them, translation services, legal services. There was enormous bureaucracy in the 19th century in terms of proving your stay and always having to carry your picture identification and paying taxes and so on. And of course, many of them didn't speak English. And so you would have some Chinese there who did have relations with non-Chinese, were able to speak some English and so on. And so those services would be there. And even for those Chinatowns where those services were not there, they would have linkages to larger cities. This is a bit later on in the 19th century, such as New York City and San Francisco, where they had larger Chinatowns. And these associations there, there would be associations there that would provide all kinds of legal advice and taxation advice, immigration advice, and so on through telegrams and such. So it's a kind of great story, but it's also a deeply tragic story and a story that's very under-regarded, actually, in terms of common knowledge, even despite its importance. I would say that the Chinese presence in America, say through the Chinatowns, could be divided into more or less three phases. The first phase, where they were imported as contract laborers, right? It was seen as a kind of Chinese experiment. That was actually a term that was bestowed on many of the Chinese, or the coolie experiment, during a time when there was a lot of movement towards a post-emancipation of slavery era. And so with the freeing of and illegalization of slave bodies, it became increasingly replaced by the commerce of contracts that were undoubtedly usurious, unidirectional, and so on, but gave a veneer of legality in terms of two parties making an agreement, even though many of the contracts were highly coerced and so on. So that was the first phase where industry was welcoming of the Chinese because there were fewer in numbers, and they were building railway, they were building all kinds of infrastructure, even dams, cutting tunnels through the Sierra Nevadas in California, sugarcane in Hawaii and such. And then you have the second phase, which is really about the end of the 1870s, where you have the invocation of Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a lot of intense anti-Sino sentiment at that time. Unions were especially saw Chinese bodies as a threat. They didn't ever imagine that maybe if we're a union, maybe we should form a fraternal relationship with the Chinese in order to fight the the gilded class, right? They, in effect, blamed the Chinese for their plight because there was a recession, even a depression going on in the 1880s. And of course, the major companies and so on, there were shoe manufacturers, sugarcane, cotton companies. They were delighted to use the Chinese workers because they were efficient, they were productive, they were cheap. And so they became triangulated in this fight in terms of the future course of American capitalism. Then I would say the last phase, which is which is the area where Robin's film deals with, is the period of cultural assimilation, really from the 1943, say 1943 is when they revoked the Chinese Exclusion Act, to the 1970s. And that was the period where you had a renovation in terms of the image of the Chinese as a model citizen. That in itself is not unproblematic because it's often used in a triangulated way against other colored bodies. And it's an example of someone who, of a type of ethnicity that was assimilable compared to others and so on. So it was a no-win situation there too. But at least from the 1940s onwards, you had this adjustment, this kind of redefinition of Chinese as good citizens and so on. And of course, we now know, especially during this pandemic, that anti-Sino sentiment kind of reared its ugly head quite quickly. Now, in terms of Kimberlee's film, what I find really interesting about it is because Kimberlee's grandfather was an important merchant wholesaler of Chinese wares in Honolulu Chinatown. And what's interesting about that is that all the way back to the 1820s, when you had the first arrival of Chinese in Hawaii, there was already very quickly being established these trade corridors by recently migrated Chinese, and these corridors corresponded to complex webs of trade that intersected the various European empires, particularly the British Empire, because the British and other European states that had concessions throughout the coastal areas of China and several Pacific ports, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, and such. And so, and throughout Australia as well, Melbourne, for example, and later on Vancouver, Guangzhou, or Canton at the time in China. And what's really interesting is that these networks transported a lot of goods into America. And Honolulu was one of the most important of the sites as a transient point of goods to the continental United States. It was, in fact, by 1840s, Honolulu was probably the most important in terms of the sandalwood trade, which is all the rage in the middle part of the 19th century. And it was probably the most important port, along with Lahaina, for sandalwood, which was incredibly profitable for these trading companies, not the Chinese ones. The Chinese Chinatowns would facilitate the importation and exportation of sandalwood and other goods. And so there's an incredibly rich material culture that has been left behind by people such as Kimberlee's grandfather and even earlier generations of merchants. And I think that's what makes Kimberlee's film interesting is that the trade networks were formed very, very early on, and in a very, very intense way throughout the Pacific and so on, especially from Guangdong and to a lesser extent Fujian provinces, the two southern provinces, and so on. So I guess I have a question for Robin and for Kimberlee. Maybe I'll start with Kimberlee. I wonder, Kimberlee, whether you've had a chance to ever study whether you have, there's even a kind of impromptu museum of your grandfather's store that you've had a chance to look at possibly as logbooks in terms of where the trade was coming from, where it was going on, and things like that.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Just want to first of all say thank you to the Chinese American Museum for having us. And it's great to be in conversation with you, Ken and Robin, who we go pretty far back with our filmmaking. So yeah, I actually tried to look into this because you had asked me that question. Just so you know, like I am the fourth generation of my Chinese family in the islands. I never met my great-grandfather. He died 2 decades before I was born. So, a lot gets a little bit lost in the family archives. No, I haven't seen the logbooks. We have a lot of photographical archives of our families, businesses, and whatnot. And my great-grandfather wrote an autobiography when he turned 81 years old, which is, the main resource that I use to do the film. I actually did an earlier film about him just for my family. This was back in 2010. I did a film just trying to learn more about my great-grandfather. And that's actually where I learned about the bubonic plague was in his autobiography. He mentions how the market burned in the 1900 fire and how they had to rebuild the business and then ended up expanding. But in terms of retaining these sort of networks back to China, I'm not really sure of the specifics. I do know that when my great-grandfather built his market, which became one of the first multi-service sort of department supermarkets in the islands, that he was very loyal. He hired a lot of people from his natal village or that area. He was from Lungdu, which is a district, I believe, in the Zhongshan area of Guangdong province. And he spoke, that was his native language or dialect was Lungdu. And so I know he was close to other people who were from that area in China. And when he built his sort of businesses, one of the things they built was a dormitory for a lot of the single male workers that had come over from China. They were mainly bachelors. And so they had a dormitory very near the business with a cafeteria and whatnot. And that's where they housed a lot of these men who came over. So I know it was very dear to him to try and help. And he always maintained contact in terms of sending things back. Later on in his life, he and several other people from his village raised money to build a school, to finance the building of a school in their village. And I actually had a chance to go back in 2010, or right before when I was making that film, 2009, and see that village. So the school in the village. So in any case, there were a lot of strong connections, but yeah, I don't know about the specific trades. It'd be really interesting to try and find those logbooks. So that'll be something I'll look into in the future.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the Chinese diaspora, and maybe it's somewhat unique to the Chinese, let's just say relatively speaking, is that these networks of trade and the idea of always being Chinese and the right of return and so on, even if it's not, even if it's spiritual, like my late grandfather used to say, you may be born and raised in Canada, and I'm Canadian and American, but remember, deep down, you're always Chinese, right? So which is a very kind of Chinese thing. It's a very generational thing, and I think that has really been impactful in terms of the circulation of commerce and trade throughout the world by the Chinese diaspora, which is the role of Hong Kong until and China today, but certainly the role of Hong Kong up until the opening up of the continent of the People's Republic of China. Right.
I have a question for Robin and Kimberlee. Give us a sense of what the Chinatown's connection to the community is and how you've seen that change over the years. Like in DC, Chinatown is not very residential anymore. There still are some residents, but the residents have now mostly moved to other parts of the area. Is the Honolulu Chinatown still residential in nature?
Well, part of my film that is tragic is that a lot of the housing that housed not just Chinese, but a whole multi-ethnic community was destroyed during urban renewal. And then other housing was put back into place in the form of high rises. But the high rises didn't necessarily engender the same kind of street community traffic that was those the same as when they had smaller tenement buildings. But there are people living in Chinatown now, and it's as you saw in Kimberlee's film, it's a problematic district. It's always kind of been seen as that because of the low rent, low income kind of nature of Chinatown from its very beginning. I think that's why the fires were allowed to be set. And even though they say it was an accident, that wasn't the first fire that had destroyed Chinatown. So it's always been a kind of a place where it seems to be constantly in transition.
Sure.
And the community that live there are also in transition. So we do have new Asian immigrants living and working in Chinatown now. And we have like artists, a community of artists who are working in Chinatown. Some of them live there. And then we have this whole new kind of, I don't know what boutique sort of shops and boutique restaurant owners that are moving into some of the smaller storefronts. So there's all kinds of things that are happening as well as the problems that Kimberlee's film highlighted. Yeah.
I think, for us here in DC, I think we have come to grips with the fact that our Chinatown will never be the same. It will never be the same as it was, but it's up to the community to help it evolve into something that's still meaningful, culturally meaningful for not just the Chinese community, but for the whole city. And, whether, even if it's not necessarily a residential hub anymore, that it becomes still that remains a cultural hub.
Mm-hmm. Kimberlee, would you say something?
No, I was just going to agree with you that, I mean, the answer to David's question, I would say yes and no, that it is still residential. And, some of the people that I highlight in the film, well, one of them, she lives there, the one who's more of the activist. And then others, still work there and their families used to live there. I mean, I think there's, when Chinatown's the first place people go when they come over, and then usually in a couple of generations, a lot of times their families leave, so I never had the experience of growing up in Chinatown. My family had been out of Chinatown, my entire life. I think my great grandfather, he had a house outside of Chinatown, sort of like that first, nice suburb outside of it. So, but it's interesting for me as a fourth generation to go back and to do what you were saying, David, is like, for me, Chinatown is a place more to connect with my cultural roots, and I feel like in the making of this film, it was an opportunity for me to get to know Honolulu Chinatown so much better. As a child, it was actually a pretty overwhelming and scary place, to be honest. I didn't necessarily always enjoy going there. And we would go when we would have, Chinese New Year dinners and whatnot, or shopping or something like that. But I feel like in making the film, I really got to see the people who live and work there every day and get to know some of their struggles and also why they love this place so much. And I really came to both admire it and also appreciate it a lot more. So it's definitely a place in flux. Like Robin said, it's also not even just a place for Chinese. Like a lot of the residents these days are, other Asian immigrants or artists or just transplants from the mainland. I mean, it's a really diverse community now. And I hope it always retains its Chinese roots and heritage. But yes, it's very diverse. And that's something I learned in making the film.
One really ironic thing I wanted to point out is that one of the reasons Nancy Bannock and her other preservation associates were able to claim Chinatown as a historic district, which is really what has saved it from being totally wiped out and replaced with high-rise developments, is because of the 1900 fire, and the rebuilding of Chinatown made it so that all of the buildings were fairly uniform in building materials, and they all have like this awning over the sidewalk on the first floor, which makes Chinatown now a very nice walkable area because you have shade and in the heat and protection from the rain and when it's raining. An architect pointed this out to me. I didn't always know that, but because the district was built up in the early 1900s and all the buildings seemed to kind of match each other at the time that in the 70s that it was awarded historic preservation status. That's sort of like why it was able to be saved when it had, the reason why those buildings are like they were is because they had all been burned down in 1900, as Kimberlee's film shows.
Would you say that there are some architectural projects or development projects that are encroaching on it now that, you know, are continued to endanger Chinatown, or as the
there's
post
the Historic Hawaii Foundation alerted me that right now there's a development corporations trying to get approval to build a high-rise hotel right on the waterfront of Chinatown, which is I guess it's on the edge of the protected district, but it would, you know, would really transform all the rest of the buildings as far as like air flow and sunshine and all that. So but yeah, it's constant, I guess. There's constant efforts to get whatever you call it, like waive the rules for our development, because our development is special or whatever. There's a lot of pressure in Hawaii because land is it's such a premium, right? I mean, I guess in every big city it's the same, but Hawaii seems to be especially vulnerable to, you know, wiping out historic areas to build.
Ken,
it's actually quite, yes, I was going to say it's actually quite rare for Chinatowns to actually survive. If you go back to the 19th century, just taking the United States, there were Chinatowns in Detroit, Cleveland, Omaha, Nebraska, if you can believe it. Many cities, right? Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Idaho City, right? Many of them were larger and more important centers. They were tied to the gold rush and so on. And so Honolulu having an historical Chinatown is actually quite rare if you start counting in all the Chinatowns that actually disappeared. All the threats to raising Honolulu Chinatown was part of civic policy at the time to actually get rid of Chinatowns, right? San Francisco Chinatown, I know people can't believe it, but after the earthquake in 1906 almost disappeared. They were going to move it down to the swamp areas of Dogpatch near Candlestick Park. And so, and DC, as David mentioned, I mean, they put in the arena there. That's always been the sports stadia has always been a major threat to Chinatown. Then doing that in Philadelphia Chinatown, now the 76ers arena wants to build it right where you bifurcate Chinatown, right? And that's because Chinatown has always, the Chinese have always represented a kind of pathological threat, a carrier of disease and of vice. And so you had zoning in Honolulu Chinatown that, you know, next to the port, and where there'd be prostitution and opium use and so on. And that was kind of semi-condoned or understood by the city. And then, of course, the Chinese would be blamed for the vice that was going on. One question I had for Robin was, were there, in terms of Nancy Bannock, who were the Chinese officials that were also active trying to preserve Honolulu Chinatown?
I can't recall his name, but there was one person who was considered the mayor of Chinatown that activated the community. But initially, according to Nancy Bannock, the there wasn't a lot of community activism to try to prevent what was going on. I know, I don't know, David, if you want to show some photographs
Yeah,
that,
sure.
I don't know, because there's some people who haven't seen the film probably, but I know that there were, because here's like a long story to your question, but Kimberlee and I have a connection through our past films too, because if anybody has seen my past film called Finding Kukan, my main character in that film, Lingai, wrote a memoir about about Honolulu Chinatown. Her mother and father were prominent doctors in Chinatown area, and one of the main characters in Lingai's memoir is Kimberlee's great-grandfather. And so one of my interests in plumbing Chinatown is to learn more about not only my ancestors, but people like Lingai and, you know, the time period. And one of the problems is that a lot of the buildings that I wanted to look at, like Lingai's parents' doctor's office, which was a landmark in Chinatown at the time, were no longer there. So these are pictures from the film, and just keep going. This is an article. This is how Nancy Bannock sort of woke the community up by writing articles and taking pictures. This is the edge of Chinatown, but along the left side is where a lot of destruction took place. That whole area was wiped out, but it was a whole Japantown with Japanese movie theaters, hotels, markets. So a huge Japanese community was also wiped out in the urban renewal part of Chinatown. And, you know, now Nuuanu Stream is like all polluted and kind of gross, but I guess fishermen used to go down in that area. But anyway, I know, okay, we're not in the film. These pictures, I put the Manapua Man is something that the other thing about the Nancy Bannock was she was able to preserve things that were disappearing in photographs. So this is the Manapua Man, which my dad and mom and grandmother used to talk about the Manapua Man coming. And I had no idea what a Manapua Man looked like until I saw this picture, because they don't exist anymore. So anyway, these are pictures that were not in the film, but it shows parts of Chinatown that were wiped out. And a lot of the pictures Nancy Bannock took show Chinese societies or proof of a Chinese group. And this is an old rice planter's mansion, which had become a little derelict. So that was also wiped out. So if you can just imagine that Li Lingai's parents' house, this is a photo I just wanted to show because it shows how many different kinds of ethnicities were living in the area that was wiped out. So you actually see a lot of Filipino names. You see some Chinese names, a Japanese name, a Hawaiian name. So and this is the Japanese area, that marketplaces that were torn down during urban renewal. The whole area was Japanese marketplaces. That a lot of the prominent stores moved to Ala Moana, the new mall that was being built in the 60s, and to other places in Honolulu. This is a Japanese fabric store that I used to go to in Ala Moana called Musashia, but it used to exist across the river from what we know of as Chinatown now. And this is one of the Japanese language theaters. And one thing that I really love about these pictures of the Japanese language theater, especially at night, is that it shows like so much community action on the street. And that kind of went away when that area was wiped out. Like at least at night, I think that because all of the people were displaced, that Chinatown, even though it was preserved as a historic district, as Kimberlee said, it was kind of scary, like Hotel Street still had a lot of prostitution and like nightclubs, a lot of vice still in Chinatown. It took a while to to transition into kind of the commerce or the boutique shops that are there now. And but anyway, to answer Ken's question, I did find a letter from Lingai about her effort to preserve her parents' house, and it was condemned by the state, and there was nothing really they could do about it. But her comment in this letter is that she's waiting to see what the state of Hawaii is going to do in condemning the house my father and mother built there over 50 years ago. The new officers of the new state have a sense of urgency in proving that they are just as modern and progressive as those of any American state, and are using every and any loophole in freezing real estate that is fee simple like ours for speculators and improvers who wish to put on a Miami or Coney Island dress over the homespun garment lined with silk, which my parents fashioned with the sweat of their brow. So I know that there were individuals like her who were trying to fight against it, but I don't think that there was ever a big, huge community push from the Chinese community that was effective until like the preservationists like Nancy Bannock, who are mostly Haole, came in to write up like historic preservation documents, and they measured all the buildings and took surveys of what had been there and what, why it was important to preserve this history. So I think it takes people who sort of know how the system works to get things like that done.
As an investigative journalist.
Right. So it's kind of funny that she wasn't part of any of the ethnic communities she was trying to help.
I think one of the interesting things about, and makes Honolulu Chinatown unique, I've only been there once, that was many years ago, is that the history of it was always very multi-ethnic. It wasn't just predominantly Chinese, as you might have in one time Seattle Chinatown, or even San Francisco Chinatown, though they have a large Japanese population, but that the history of indentured labor in Honolulu during the Kingdom of Hawaii brought in Pacific Islanders, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, even Koreans, Indonesians. And so you had a lot of different people who were working the sugarcane plantations and so on. I guess what I'm interested in is also that whether there even exists today, is there a museum of Honolulu Chinatown? Is there any museum that actually documents the history of Honolulu Chinatown in Honolulu? This is a question for both.
I think there is a museum, isn't there, Robin? Like along one of those.
Yeah,
it's very small.
There's a Chinese heritage, Chinatown Heritage Society. I apologize, I'm saying the name wrong, but actually they give tours of Chinatown, which is, you see a little bit of it in my film. And there is a storefront center that collects ethnic material from people who lived in Chinatown. They have some written documents too, I believe. And Karen Motosui is head of that, and she's actually Japanese American, and her family used to live in the area that I was showing that had been wiped out. So her family was displaced. Her family owned a hotel, and it had been gone to, I think, 2 or 3 generations before it was wiped out. So, but she's the executive director, and if you're in Honolulu, that's a really great tour to go on. They have a website, and sorry, I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's not funded by any government agency. It's totally independent nonprofit.
And then
So that
there's a Hawaii Chinese History Center, I believe. I'm not sure if that's their name, but they actually have their office in my family's building. And I think they're more for Chinese Hawaii families, and Chinese families in Hawaii go there and they can help with genealogy and things like that, family records. So I know they exist, but I don't know if their mandate is more of like the history of Chinatown overall, or more for like people looking into their own family history.
How much exposure have both
There
your
was-
films had in the Honolulu area? And have you given a copy to every urban planner and development review board?
Well, my film was really meant for a local audience and to spark conversation through the Historic Hawaii Foundation. So I really didn't plan to go traveling with it to film festivals. And it's actually very heartening to know that your museum, David, and so many of the people here today were interested in it. And I think because as Ken pointed out, there's so much commonality in how Chinatowns have been disappearing and wiped out or being attacked during COVID. And I think people really it's an important connection to our ancestral past to be able to go to a physical site and see, this is where my great grandmother went shopping, or where the big fire that they talked about happened, or any number of important historic moments. And so to not have Honolulu Chinatown is really kind of a scary notion, because it is one of the few districts where you get a sense of what things were like in the early 20th century.
Go ahead, Ken.
There were several overlapping similar questions from the listeners, and they all seem to have to do with gentrification, the problem of gentrification, art galleries moving in. And I guess the question from many of the listeners is, how do you save the soul of Chinatown during this moment?
Kim, I think maybe you might have some ideas, or at least you can, because you've talked to current business owners.
Yeah, well, there are some organizations in Chinatown. So the Chinatown Business and Community Association, I know, is very active and looking at some of these issues. And they, so the activist in my film, Chulan, Schubert Kwok, she's very active and works a lot with the different elected officials to advocate. There's a Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and there's a group of younger Chinese, I think Chinatown 808. So that definitely there's some groups that are trying to activate and deal with some of the issues. I mean, I think what really galvanized the community was really during the early pandemic and some of the rise in crime, or what seemed like the perceived rise in crime and homelessness in the area. And that got people, especially the business owners, to sort of come together. But yeah, I mean, I think it has to start with the people who live and work there, right? And then working with the elected officials. But it's complicated. Yeah,
I know one of the wins that recently happened. I know one of the business owners was in Chinatown was pushing for a historic preservation commission, which would help kind of. Besides the Historic Hawaii Foundation, it was a government institution that they wanted to create that would have people from the communities involved. And that was just established by the mayor. So there's hope that, because the naming of a historic district doesn't necessarily mean funding is appropriated to help these landlords keep their buildings up and do the things that are necessary to maybe subsidize rent for a historic business to prevent the kinds of gentrification people are worried about. So this kind of commission is a starting point, and maybe they'll get enough kind of momentum, or that'll be a a way that they can lobby the city government for more support for, keeping Chinatown, some historic part of Chinatown there.
And you mentioned that there are Chinese, more recent Chinese immigrants to Honolulu.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, if you
But
go
they-
to Honolulu, you see a lot of Vietnamese restaurants and grocery stores and Laotian.
Mhm.
Kimberlee, what are some of the
I
other?
think Thai and Filipino. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, lots of Vietnamese. I mean, I think there's actually, when you walk around, there's like more pho restaurants than Chinese
Right.
restaurants, it seems. I haven't actually counted, but
Yeah.
Um,
I think there was also, when the handover happened, we got some Hong Kong dim sum restaurants that you didn't have before. Like, we didn't used to have that big of fancy dim sum restaurants. I think they kind of came from Hong Kong. And we also are getting Szechuanese, not right in Chinatown, but I've seen like more in the Kaka'ako area, more Szechuanese hot pot type of restaurants. And so I'm thinking that we also are having more mainland Chinese coming from that area. They're not all from southern China anymore.
that's really interesting, sort of the diversity of the Chinese in Hawaii. And I'm sure the same thing's happening, across the continent, but like historically in Hawaii it was, all Cantonese speaking and from southern China. And like Robin said, there's a lot more different kinds of Chinese cuisines and Chinese languages being spoken and things like that. So it's really interesting.
They wouldn't have the same relationship to the history of Chinatowns either, right? Because, for example, I teach a course on the history of Chinatown at Penn. I took my class to New York. We visited both Chinatowns, two major ones, the old one and the huge new one in Queens, in Flushing, Queens. And all the Chinese who were from mainland Chinese, who were students of mine, they didn't like the old Chinatown. They said it doesn't feel Chinese, it doesn't feel like part of them. But they go to Flushing, which is all, much more recent Chinese, and they go, wow, we feel like we're at home. This is truly Chinatown. And so on. So it's very complicated, these dynamics at play with what we call Chinatown.
Yeah, I would say the same here in DC. Rockville, Maryland, is very much like one locus, central point for the Chinese community. But that's interesting. Is there sort of a Flushing, New York in Hawaii as well, where there's like some suburban communities where Chinese or Asian Hawaiians have, relocated to, and you can kind of see?
It's hard to really pinpoint in Hawaii because we're the only state that is majority Asian. We have, I think, like 46% of our population is Asian.
Yeah.
So
Right.
to kind of, there's certainly probably
There's
new
certain neighborhoods
settlement.
that are like known for different ethnic groups, but it's not like Chinatown. It's I don't know.
It's
and
not as
It's not as
pronounced.
stratified.
prominent as like Flushing, Queens, or
Mhm.
where there's a really, or I know like in Atlanta, I think there's in other states there are new communities of in Los Angeles there's like a huge area. I went to visit the public library there, and I was like amazed at how many Chinese language signs were
Right.
on the storefronts. And I can't remember the name of that community, but there's nothing as big and like centralized in Hawaii. There's like a lot of, it feels like a lot of new Asians coming to Hawaii, but they don't tend to really be in one particular area that I could see anyway.
So I think we're winding down to some of our final minutes. Are there any new projects that you're working on, or that you are you're seeing on the horizon for both of you in terms of films?
Well, yeah, and actually, I'd love to talk to you more about it, David, later. But so I'm developing a documentary about the late Chinese American activist and writer Iris Chang, who wrote the book The Rape of Nanking,
Sure.
the Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. And so, yeah, looking through her
Oh, that'd be
story.
terrific.
Yeah, through her story, sort of looking at issues of historical justice, as well as issues of identity, achievement, and also mental wellness.
Sure.
You know, so that's what's on the horizon for me in the
Oh,
next few
that
years.
sounds really exciting. Yeah.
And I'm working on a new project about Hawaiian language newspapers. It's really in the early research stage. So Hawaiian language newspapers were published between the 1840s to the 1940s, and there were like 100 different Hawaiian language newspapers, and they contain not just news items, but a lot of the cultural material that was passed from oral tradition in Hawaii to written tradition at the time. But one of my research tracks has been to track through the Hawaiian language newspapers my own ancestors' history in Hawaii and how they were affected by the things like the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the annexation of Hawaii to the United States, and the way that Hawaiian language newspapers reported on the Chinese community versus the English language newspapers. As Ken mentioned, there was a period of time, right, when the Chinese Exclusion Act came out and there was so much anti-Chinese sentiment. Well, that traveled into Hawaii and came out in the English language press before Hawaii was even annexed to the United States. But I haven't learned enough Hawaiian, and I haven't hired a translator to really help me, but initial research looks like Hawaiian language press definitely had a much more generous view of Chinese. A lot of the Chinese married Native Hawaiian women, so there were a lot of legislators who had relatives who were part Chinese or who were part Chinese themselves. So in trying to get anti-Chinese legislation passed, for instance, the pro-American forces had to deal with Hawaiians who were very pro-Chinese. Right. So anyway, it's a very interesting research topic that, will take
We're looking forward
probably
to
another couple years.
We're setting up the webinar right now. Well, Ken,
Anyway.
do you have a final question?
No, but I'm also working on a project, if I may. I wrote a screenplay. I wrote a screenplay set in 1868 about Chinese contract laborers along the Nascent going on a wagon train to Idaho City, Idaho, during the Idaho's gold rush. And it's a kind of a Western, I guess, but it's a travelogue film about a mining company that hired 2 wagons full of Chinese contract laborers to work in the mines. And so that's actually, I wouldn't say it's under development, but it's been signed on. And so we'll see. Hopefully,
that sounds great.
Hopefully it won't die in terms of the, the development hell, but so far it's pretty good.
Wow, excellent. That's awesome. That sounds like a great story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there should be more films that Robin and Kimberlee are doing. These stories are incredibly valuable and even salient to understanding, American society, any society, and yet it's not known enough. And I think I'm grateful to both Robin and Kimberlee for the work they do.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for that recognition. So I will leave my link up for another week. So if anybody in the audience wants to share it, please share it with whoever. And then eventually it will be on the YouTube channel, Historic Hawaii Foundation. And if you are interested in seeing more of Nancy's photographs of the entire Hawaii, there is a short film on their Historic Hawaii Foundation website on Nancy's slides.
Okay, we will we'll follow up to all the webinar registrants with an email that consolidates some links and it will give you your last chance to watch the films. And I thank all three of you for joining us tonight. It's really been great, and I really appreciate just the fact that you created these films and that you're telling these stories. And you know, hats off to Nancy Bannock. Hats off to Kimberlee's you know, parents for, you know, being pioneers and champions of, you know, protecting culture and you know, legacy and history. It's just it's very important work all around. And Ken, thank you so much. And
Thank you, David. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Kimberlee.
Thank you.
Yeah,
all.
absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Mahalo nui.
for everyone from joining us, and we will see everybody soon.